world may be developing. So let's begin with prayer. This is a prayer for the unity of the church from the prayer book. Let's pray together. Almighty Father, whose blessed Son, before his passion, prayed for his disciples that they might be one, as you and he are one, grant that your church, being bound together in love and obedience to you, may be united in one body by the one Spirit, that the world may believe in him whom you have sent, your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. So last week we talked about sort of the development of the Anglican Communion and what it really means to be Anglican. We looked at some of the early formularies of Anglican faith and identity, such as the 39 Articles, the writings of Richard Hooker, those sorts of things. Today we're looking at the Anglican Communion more in modernity and the way that we articulate what it means to be Anglican, and particularly what it means to be in communion with one another. The definition of communion is related to the thing that we do here at this altar and at the altar in the church, which is to celebrate communion. So for Christians, right, the Eucharist, the communion, is sort of our fullest act of Christian worship and our fullest act of being in communion with one another. It literally means that we're all willing to share communion together. You might know that if you're Episcopalian and if you go to like a Roman Catholic church or an Orthodox church, you are not invited to receive communion. That is the rule of those particular churches, right? And that indicates that we are not in communion, right? And that is sad, and it can be difficult, and people also choose to independently circumvent those rules, which I don't personally endorse. But it's a sign of the reality that we are at such a difference with one another that we are not able to share communion. On the other hand, in the Episcopal Church, one of our values is what used to be called open table, but now that means something else, that anyone who is a baptized Christian in any church is invited to receive communion in our church. So we invite people coming from Roman Catholic and Orthodox backgrounds to receive, if they choose, people from Protestant backgrounds to come and receive communion and to be part of communion with us, meaning that we are sharing in the life of the church together. It's a sort of visible unity. So when we think of communion, we're primarily actually talking about being able to share communion with one another. It also has sort of a broader definition, which is about unity, right? This sort of visible unity of being able to cooperate with one another, sharing of ministers, sharing of fellowship, all of these sorts of things. One of the principles that we talked about last week was the idea of the autonomous national church. So we looked at that list of 42 provinces of the Anglican Communion, which, spoiler, is maybe a little bit shorter this week than it was last week. And each of those is a church that's associated with a particular country in the world, or sometimes multiple, but they're all particular expressions of Anglicanism that are all united under this one sort of flag of the Anglican Communion. So we don't believe that in order to be at unity, we need to all be sort of part of the same singular church body. That's what Roman Catholics believe, right? Is that they have to all be united as the Roman Catholic Church under the Pope, and that's what constitutes that visible unity. Our model is much more similar to the Orthodox model, where there are different churches locally adapted throughout the world that all share communion with one another. So they're autonomous. The Orthodox call them autocephalous, which means they have their own head. I think it's a great word. We don't use that word as much, but we believe that as well, right? So as the Episcopal Church, which is the Anglican expression in the United States, as well as in several other countries, we have a presiding bishop who is our sort of source of authority. And we are in communion with other Anglican churches across the world, but we don't all sort of share one head. We don't have a pope. So because of that, it does bring up some difficulties, right? How do you sort of observe this unity if you don't have a single figure to look to provide that source of unity? If you don't require doctrinal conformity to a tome of doctrine to ensure that everyone is sort of in line. It's a little bit more challenging. And so one of the ways that have evolved, and I put the dates that each of these was established because it happens over time, but one of the ways that this evolves is what we now call the instruments of communion. So could I get a volunteer to just read this definition of the instruments from the Anglican Communion Office? And then, Jim, you're also volunteering to pass the microphone around when you're done. Thank you.
Every member of the Church of the Anglican Communion is autonomous and interdependent. The shared life of the Anglican Communion is supported by what we are known as the instruments of the Anglican Communion. Each instrument helps to foster unity and cooperation between the member churches. They facilitate dialogue, coordinate mission, and address challenges facing the Anglicans globally.
Thank you, Jim. Just a reminder that because the sort of historic center of the Anglican Communion is the Church of England, they use British English. So you correctly pronounced each instrument help, because instrument is a collective noun here, and so it takes a singular verb in British English. So, well done. I enjoy that. So let's look at these four instruments. We talked about two of them last week because they were part of the development. So the first, the oldest, is the Archbishop of Canterbury. That's the closest we have, but it is not, let me be emphatic, the Archbishop of Canterbury is not the Anglican version of the Pope. If we had one, that's who it would be, but we don't. The Archbishop of Canterbury is the head of the Church of England. They carry the title Primate of all England, which is the mother church of the Anglican Communion. Therefore, the Archbishop of Canterbury serves as a focus of unity for the entire communion. The ABC, as she is sometimes known, does not have any sort of jurisdictional authority over any province other than the Church of England, but has traditionally been seen both as a pastoral figure for the communion, and the term that's often used is the primus inter pares, the first among equals. Right, so all of the primates of all the churches, and we'll get to that as a separate instrument of unity, have really equal authority, right? They're all the heads of their own autonomous churches, but the Archbishop of Canterbury presides over them as the first among equals. So a sort of leadership from within, but a focus of unity. And so the Archbishop of Canterbury traditionally does have some pastoral roles within the wider communion, is a person to whom Anglicans around the world look for particular guidance around particular issues. There currently is not an Archbishop of Canterbury. This is something to clarify given recent news. So the 105th Archbishop of Canterbury was Justin Welby. He served from 2013, and he resigned on the Feast of the Epiphany in 2025, so earlier this year in January was his last day in office. The 106th Archbishop of Canterbury has been nominated, but has not been officially elected, because those are separate processes. So she is technically known now as the Archbishop of Canterbury designate. Her name is Sarah Mullally. She's been knighted. We'll talk more about her later. She's really cool. She's currently the Bishop of London, which is the third most senior bishop in the Church of England. So Canterbury, the Archbishop of York, and then the Bishop of London is sort of the third ranking bishop. So she's already been a high ranking bishop for a decade, but she will be officially elected in January of next year, and then we will call her the Archbishop of Canterbury. She's technically not yet. She'll be the first woman to hold that position, and she'll also be only the second person who is not educated at either Oxford or Cambridge to hold that position. The second instrument is the Lambeth Conference, which we also talked about. We talked about the first couple of Lambeth conferences last week. This is a conference that is supposed to meet every 10 years. The reality of that is a little bit messier, but it meets approximately every 10 years. That's the goal. It is convened in England, and it's convened by invitation of the Archbishop of Canterbury. So this is, again, another way that the Archbishop of Canterbury sort of executes that leadership as the first among equals, is that all the bishops in the entire communion are invited to gather, but the invitation is issued by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And the Lambeth conferences meet to discuss various issues. Some of them are like purely internal Anglican, like doctrinal and ecclesial issues, but others are issues that are facing the whole world. So during COVID, the Lambeth conference didn't meet during COVID. I'll come back to that. But they meet to talk about war, to talk about issues of hunger, issues of injustice around the world, to provide support for one another, and to often to issue some sort of particularly Anglican response to the issues. As I said, it meets about every 10 years. The longest gap between meetings was from 1930 to 1948 due to the political unrest in Europe that led to World War II. And then there was also a 14-year gap between the 2008 and 2022 Lambeth conferences, which partially had to do with some of the issues we're going to talk about, and then was delayed another 2 years due to COVID. But the last Lambeth conference was the 15th, and there were over 600 bishops from around the world that attended. And you can look up, they always take group pictures of all the bishops in their like purple cassocks, which are all slightly different colors. And you get really a picture of the incredible diversity of the Anglican Communion. Africa is probably the continent with the most Anglicans. But the US and England are usually, and some of the other English-speaking European countries are usually overrepresented. So you get a real mix of races, you get a mix of genders, because many provinces besides us also ordain women, and differences in age. So it's a cool picture just to see, these are all the people that we share in communion with. Now clearly, and because of sort of the 2025 stuff that we have to talk about, we're gonna go a little bit lighter over the 20th century than I hoped to, but clearly something is going on that in the 1970s, we add 2 more instruments of communion. So this is picking up the pace of adding other things that help us understand this visible unity. One is the primates meeting, which was established in 1978. I reminded us last week that primate here does not refer to humanoid animals. It refers to the heads of churches, like primus, the first. So just a reminder. So primates refers to either archbishops or presiding bishops. They have different names in different churches due to language and cultural differences. Like in the Church of England, the celebrant is called the president at the liturgy. And we can't use that word here because it would be confusing, right? We sometimes say presider, which is sort of a made-up word, because we can't say president because it would confuse everyone every day. So the primates meet, again, this invitation is issued by the Archbishop of Canterbury, but they meet every 2 years. And they also have a standing committee that's a little bit smaller that meets pretty regularly. The most recent primates meeting was held in Rome in 2024 and was attended by 32 primates. Remember, there should be about 42. So a significant majority of them were there. There were a few who stayed away due to illness or they were just too busy. And then there were a couple that did not attend deliberately. And I feel like I'm really building up the suspense for page 3 of the handout. So, and then finally we have, and this is probably the most novel of these 4 instruments, is the Anglican Consultative Council. It's the only instrument that includes people who are not bishops. But in 1971, they decided that maybe people who aren't bishops could also have a voice in global Anglicanism. So this council has about 100 members. It's made up of 2 to 3 representatives from each province, and that can include lay people, deacons, priests, and bishops. Don't worry, the Archbishop of Canterbury is also on this, so they're still present. The ACC meets every 3 years, generally, in various places around the world. So unlike the Lambeth Conference, which is always in Canterbury and in London, both the primates and the ACC meet in various locations around the world. The next meeting will be the 19th, and it's meeting in Ireland next summer. And again, they also have a standing committee that meets more frequently. On the Anglican Communion website, anglicancommunion.org, which I have a link to at the bottom at the end of the handout, You can go and you can read the minutes from every meeting of the ACC, from every Lambeth Conference, from every Primates meeting, and get a sense of the breadth of issues that are discussed. Of course, they're short, they're like one-page summaries usually of several day-long meetings, but you can get a sense of the various kinds of work that these bodies do. There are also, I should add, a number of sort of interim commissions and bodies and all sorts of things that these groups then appoint people to. One that I'm familiar with is called the Inter-Anglican Liturgical Commission, or IALC. It's again a group of liturgical scholars, priests, bishops, lay people from around the communion that gather regularly. I think the last one was just a few years ago, to talk about sort of various issues, like how do Anglicans understand the Eucharist? How do Anglicans understand baptism? And get perspective from the breadth of the communion on how those things are understood, and then try to come to some sort of agreement about what we understand. Any questions on the instruments of communion? It's a great phrase. So we have our instruments, and they are a way of expressing our unity in a visible way. So another way that we want to express unity, right? Jesus prays that the church may all be one, and this is a prayer that I think the Anglican churches have tried to move towards answering. Like that's always been sort of an earnest goal, and that leads to not only understanding ourselves as in communion with other Anglican churches, but how can we share in communion with churches that do not identify as Anglican? Is that even possible? And so some work in the late 19th century and through the 20th century happened on what we call ecumenism, which is the work of sharing in communion and sharing in visible unity with other Christians. So you might have also heard the word interfaith. Interfaith and ecumenical are different things. Both are valuable, but they're very different goals. So ecumenical work is focused on other Christian churches. So the idea that we could, within some sphere, we all hold the same belief, like that's actually a value in ecumenism. Interfaith is about our mutual respect and appreciation for other religions, which Anglicans are also involved in, but that's not what I'm talking about right here. So I just want to clarify that, what we're talking about when we say ecumenical work. So the first sort of official statement about this actually originates in the United States in a general convention in Chicago in 1886, I believe. And then that text was taken to the following Lambeth Conference and approved there as sort of a statement for what it means for churches to be in communion with one another. So could I get a volunteer to read the Chicago Lambeth Quadrilateral?
Yes. That in the opinion of this conference, the following articles supply a basis on which approach may be by God's blessing made towards home reunion. The Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments as containing all things necessary to salvation and as being the rule and ultimate standard of faith. The Apostles' Creed and the baptismal symbol and the Nicene Creed as sufficient statements of the Christian faith. The two sacraments ordained by Christ himself, baptism and the supper of the Lord, ministered with unfailing use of Christ's words of institution and the elements ordained by him. And the historic episcopate locally adapted in the methods of its administration to the varying needs of the nations and peoples called to God into the unity of his church.
Thanks, Haley. Okay, so let's just translate that from 19th century British English. What are the things that are important in order for churches to be united with one another? So shout out things. The Bible.
Apostles' Creed.
The creeds. Sacraments. And so baptism as one of the sacraments. Yep. Baptism and Eucharist as the two major sacraments. And then what's the fourth thing? Yeah, so bishops and the apostolic succession. Yeah, so episcopate meaning, right, bishops And the historic part referring to the idea of apostolic succession, which we talked about last week, right? That all of our bishops, and therefore all of our priests and deacons, have been ordained by a laying down of hands that's passed all the way from the apostles. So those are the things, right? So this does two things, right? It helps us when we make ecumenical agreements, which the Episcopal Church has made a number of. Probably the most significant is the agreement with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the ELCA, with which we've shared full communion for about 20 to 25 years now. And in other parts of the country where there are more Lutherans, this is even more significant. It means that because we've agreed on these things, and we've done the nitty-gritty work of figuring out what that actually looks like in practice, but it means that our ministers can be mutually shared, right? So you can have an Episcopal congregation that the rector is an ELCA pastor, because we accept their ordinations, we accept their sacraments, and it's mutual, right? We're currently working on dialoguing towards a similar articulation agreement with the United Methodist Church, which is a little bit more complicated because their understandings are a little bit further away, so we have to work on some things there. But this is an actual thing that's been put into practice. Quadrilateral, because it has these four things, right? These four elements that help us understand, like, what are really the essentials of the Christian faith, right? They define what the essentials of the faith are for us, and what it means, like what constitutes a church that we would be willing to enter into an agreement of communion, is that we can come to a similar enough understanding of these four things. It's pretty broad, right? And the goal there is to sort of maximize the amount of communion that we're able to share, right? That's something that we really value. In the past, Anglicans were involved pretty heavily in dialogue with the Orthodox churches. We made some decisions that put a stop to that, and I'm not too upset that we did that. I think that was the right thing to do. But like, there was a serious possibility of a communion agreement with the Orthodox Church. It's always been a little bit more difficult with Roman Catholics because of their particular polity. But that's something that we're open to, that we say we're open to. So that defines our sort of relationships with other non-Anglican churches, but what we still haven't really done is get to a satisfying definition of what it means to be Anglican, or what the Anglican Communion actually is. But in 1930, the Lambeth Conference actually approved a statement of the nature and status of the Anglican Communion. So I get a volunteer to read this out. James.
The conference approves the following statement of nature and status of the Anglican Convention, as a term used in its resolutions. The Anglican Convention is a fellowship within the one Holy Catholic and Apostolic Church of those duly constituted dioceses, provinces, or regional churches in communion with the See of Canterbury, which have the following characteristics in common. A. They uphold and propagate the Catholic and Apostolic faith and order as they are generally set forth in the Book of Common Prayer as authorized in their several churches. They are particular or national churches, and as such, promote within each of their territories a national expression of Christian faith, life, and worship. And C. They are bound together not by central legislative or executive authority, but by mutual loyalty sustained through the common council of the bishops in conference. The conference makes a statement praying for and eagerly awaiting the time in which the churches of the present Anglican Communion will enter into communion with other parts of the Catholic Church, not definable as Anglican in the above sense, as a step towards the ultimate reunion of all Christendom in one visibly united fellowship.
Thank you. So some lofty goals there, but some really helpful things that help us understand what it means to be Anglican. So shout out, just we'll do sort of a Lectio Divina on this. Like, what are some words or phrases that stand out to you as particularly meaningful in this definition? James. Yeah, The hope and hope for unity. Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's very aspirational, right? And almost 100 years later, it maybe looks even more aspirational than it did in 1930. Yeah. Other things.
Mutual loyalty.
Yeah, that was the one that stood out to me. Mutual loyalty. Like, what a great concept, right? Is that there's this mutuality of support and love for each other as part of this communion. Yeah, and like uncharacteristically for these sorts of statements, it actually is like this. We are not doing this, right? So we do not have a central legislative or executive authority. That will be pertinent later. But that's a big part of what it means, right? All of those instruments of communion, they issue statements and resolutions, but none of them are binding in the sense that they're not telling the other churches what to do. They are coming to agreement, and they're doing mutual discernment. James? So yeah, that's a good point. It doesn't the thing about legislative authority is about how the churches are related to one another. There are several churches in the Anglican Communion that are state churches. Oh, okay. Yeah, including the Church of England. I don't have a list off the top of my head, but definitely the Church of England, right? Like the King of England is still the supreme governor of the Church of England. So that's actually part of maybe an Anglican colonial legacy that we still need to be aware of and working to think about how that affects our understanding of being Anglican.
Thank you for explaining that.
Yeah.
I kind of misread that. Thank you.
Any others? Jim? Good, yes, the Book of Common Prayer, right, as sort of a standard, and the first thing that defines what it means to be Anglican is our understanding of the Book of Common Prayer. But what about the Book of Common Prayer as authorized in their several churches, right? So already in 1930, the acknowledgement that there isn't actually the Book of Common Prayer. There are many books of common prayer. Each national church has its own Book of Common Prayer that bears more or less resemblance to whichever Book of Common Prayer you want to call the original Book of Common Prayer, right? Because we talked about that last week. There are several options. James?
Are these books of common prayer written in the nation's own language? Like, we're not using like English as like Italian?
Yeah, good. That's a good question. Generally, yes. In countries where English is maybe one of the languages, it's more likely to still be in English. But translations of the Book of Common Prayer into other languages are definitely, there are many. Including our own Book of Common Prayer, right, which has official translations into Spanish, French, Haitian Creole, Navajo, many other languages that are like used, Mandarin, that are used regularly. But in other provinces, like a lot of the African provinces, right, like English is still English is sort of the lingua franca, like that people of different tribes like speak English to communicate with one another, so their liturgies tend to still be in English, but in other countries like Rwanda, the name of their province is in French, so my guess is that their prayer book is also in French. I don't know that for sure. Yeah, good question. Okay. So now that we've got these really beautiful and tidy understandings of what it means to be Anglican, what it means to be in communion with one another, let's look at what actually happened in reality. And I'll just preface that some of this can be difficult to hear, especially for American Episcopalians, because we're sort of on, even if you see yourself as like a conservative American Episcopalian, you're still on one end of a spectrum. And so when we read some of these things, like, remember that the Anglican Communion spoke to a reality in 1930 that we do not have a central legislative authority. And so statements of these conferences reflect sometimes the majority opinion of the communion, but they do not necessarily reflect the opinion of the individuals at the conferences or of the church of which we are a part, right? They do reflect the ideals of churches with which we hope to share communion, because we've said that the sort of standards for that are very broad. Okay, so in the 1970s, many Anglican provinces, the Episcopal Church wasn't the first one, but we were early, began ordaining women to orders of ministry. The diaconate, because of a sort of complicated history with an order of deaconesses, was not as controversial, but the ordination of women to the priesthood, and especially to the episcopate, provided some level of controversy. Again, the Anglican Communion does not have a central legislative authority, so it was not up to the bishops of the Anglican Communion to sort of authorize the ordination of women across the church, right? That's not a thing that they have the opportunity to do. And so each province makes that decision for itself. At this point in time, there are about 5 of the 42 provinces that don't allow the ordination of women to the priesthood. So the vast majority of Anglican provinces have female priests. There are several more that don't allow female bishops, and then there are also several that have approved the ordination of women to the episcopate but don't have any yet, because you have to then, right, like it's a theoretical possibility, but then one has to be elected. In the Episcopal Church, that took 13 years. So the ordination of women to all orders of ministry was authorized in 1976. The first female bishop wasn't consecrated until 1989. That sometimes takes some time. Interestingly, even though, like, and I'll just say this because we just did this with my students at St. Martin's, there are passages in the Bible that, like, pretty clearly say that, like, women shouldn't have authority in the church. Like, that's what it says. Obviously, as a part of this church, like, I have to interpret that in a particular way, right? But just to say that, like, it takes particular scriptural interpretation, a particular approach to the Bible, which we believe is the Word of God and contains all things necessary to salvation. But a particular interpretation of Scripture and of the tradition using human reason, we talked about those 3 things last week, that allows these churches, again, the vast majority of Anglican churches, to come to agreement about the status of women as being able to be ordained. And that's been relatively uncontroversial, like, over time. The thing that, for some reason, is the sticking point is sexuality. So the 1998 Lambeth Conference put out a resolution that I decided not to reprint in full, but you can look it up if you want to. Basically, it states, and again, this is a statement of the Lambeth Conference. It was not approved unanimously. States that marriage is between a man and a woman, and, quote, cannot advise the legitimizing or blessing of same-sex unions, nor ordaining those involved in same-gender unions. So this was a statement that the Lambeth Conference made in 1998. In 2003, the Episcopal Church consecrated Jean Robinson as the bishop, I think, of Vermont, but now I'm not sure that's correct. I didn't look that up. Might have been New Hampshire. But a state in New England. He was the first openly gay bishop in the world, actually, but in the Anglican Communion. His election was somewhat controversial. Was anyone, like, around aware for those debates? Yeah, a couple folks. It embroiled the church in some real controversy. The churches within the Episcopal Church have to weigh in on that, right? So they, you might not know this, but when a bishop is elected in the Episcopal Church, the other dioceses have to consent to the election. The bishop and the standing committee consent to that election. And so because of his sexuality, many dioceses or bishops did not want to consent to his election. And then it ended up getting brought to the General Convention, which was a rule that they've since gotten rid of, that If the election happened within a certain amount of time before the General Convention, then the whole convention would vote on it. They don't do that anymore, partially because it was a mess. So this was a real flashpoint, both for the Episcopal Church, but also for the wider Anglican Communion. And it created some distrust. And I'm not endorsing that distrust, but, right, so in 1998, right, like this statement was made, and then 5 years later, the Episcopal Church votes to ordain an openly gay man to the episcopate. So in 2008, which was the next Lambeth Conference, a lot of bishops from more conservative provinces boycotted the Lambeth Conference, so they didn't attend. And they actually had their own conference at the same time, which they called the Global Anglican Futures Conference, or GAFCON, and that met in Jerusalem. As a result, sort of supported by that, but also as a result of the controversy within the Episcopal Church, a new denomination, the Anglican Church in North America, was formed. How many of you heard of that? Good, that's a good number, not too many. It is a conservative, a biblically conservative analog of the Episcopal Church. So it was mostly founded by people who left the Episcopal Church because they disagreed with the direction that we were moving, primarily on sexuality. So this formed, they are a participant in GAFCON, but they are not a member of the Anglican Communion. So this is where things start to get really murky, is that GAFCON is this organization of Anglican churches, but now has members which are not members of the Anglican Communion, right? So we're starting to build this like Venn diagram, and it brings into question, like, what does it mean to be Anglican? There are analogs of the ACNA in Australia, in New Zealand, and in England, just to name a few places. So as this controversy continues, the primates met in 2016, and they, quote unquote, suspended the Episcopal Church. And this was also like high drama for people at this time. This is in response to, in 2015, the Episcopal Church changed the canons, our church law, to change the definition of marriage to 2 persons, and subsequent liturgies that authorized same-sex marriage. Can someone read this statement? Thank you, Susie, for volunteering.
It is our unanimous desire to walk together. However, given the seriousness of these matters, we formally acknowledge the distance by requiring that for a period of 3 years, the Episcopal Church no longer represent us on ecumenical and interfaith bodies, should not be appointed or elected to an internal standing committee, and that while participating in the internal bodies of the Anglican Communion, they will not take part in decision-making on any issues pertaining to doctrine or polity.
Thank you. So it sounds really serious, right? But also, what does it actually mean, right? There's a sort of impaired communion, that's a phrase that's used, but the Anglican Communion does not really have the ability to kick someone out of the Anglican Communion, and I'm not sure that if it come to a vote that they would have actually voted in that way. Rather, it's an acknowledgement of what some provinces, what some bishops felt like was a betrayal of that mutual loyalty that we talked about as a principle, right? That maybe we were moving too fast, and that the other provinces couldn't get on board with that. And so just really, it's an acknowledgement of reality, but then came with these sort of weird sanctions. Also in 2016, and we won't read this, but I just learned this in preparing for this. Apparently the ACNA actually tried to join the Anglican Communion, and the primates were like, well, that isn't our job, and also this would bring up a lot of questions that we don't want to answer. Questions of polity and jurisdiction. There was, I think we read this last week, there's a resolution about not having overlapping geographic churches, right? So we have these national churches, but you cannot have 2 churches in the same place. This actually originates during the colonial enterprise. So England and the US could not colonize the same place. And therefore, you could not have Anglican churches from different countries in the same place. That's how it originates. But it's actually a really good principle. that you can't have two different Anglican bodies in the same geographic location. The only exception is the continent of Europe, where there are both American churches and Church of England churches. Okay, so since 2016, the archbishops of 3 provinces, Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda, have basically not participated in the instruments of communion. So they've stopped attending the primates meetings, they've stopped attending the Lambeth conferences, and are not participating fully in these instruments of communion that are the way that we express our Anglican identity. 2022 was the last Lambeth conference. This revisited human sexuality in a way that angered everybody, which is a classic Anglican move. There was no vote taken, so there was conversation, but I don't know that there was anything that could be counted as like progress. In 2024, the primates met in Rome. As I said, 32 of the 42 primates were there. There were 4 that didn't even acknowledge the invitation. I assume that that's Nigeria, Rwanda, and Uganda, and I don't know what the 4th province is. But the other ones reaffirmed that 1930 resolution that we read earlier about the nature of the communion, reiterating that we don't have legislative authority over one another. And so the provinces that don't agree with the Episcopal Church cannot force us to change our doctrine, and we also can't force them to change their doctrine, right? It's a mutuality there. At the end of 2024, Archbishop Welby resigned as Archbishop of Canterbury, effective Epiphany 2025. The major catalyst for that was the gross mishandling of a child abuse case in the Church of England that had been going on for decades. And sorry, my bad, it'll come back. Basically, as Archbishop of Canterbury, right, the buck stops there, and Archbishop Welby could have done more and didn't, and so he said he wasn't going to resign, and then a couple days later he admitted that he needed to resign. And so then the selection process for the next Archbishop of Canterbury started. I hope this will come back. This involves and again, this is an internal Church of England process, although for the first time it did include some input from the wider Anglican Communion, sort of acknowledging the ways that the Archbishop of Canterbury has a role within the larger Anglican Communion. Okay. Sorry about this. There it is. Great. All right. Okay, and now we have just a couple of minutes to talk about what happened this week. On October 16th, that was Thursday, the Archbishop of Rwanda, who's currently the sort of chairperson of GAFCON, the Global Anglican Futures Conference, announced in a statement titled, "The Future Has Arrived," that he is creating what he calls the Global Anglican Communion. So some sort of separate and, in his view, more real Anglican communion that is not in communion with Canterbury. So sort of an official split. Clearly, this is in response to the election of Bishop Sarah, because that was announced 2 weeks ago, and he refers to that. Interestingly, it's not really focused on her gender. So the fact that it's a female Archbishop of Canterbury is not the sort of major flashpoint, but rather on her support, or her inferred support of LGBT issues. I think that her support of LGBT issues is lukewarm at best. She said something was it's good. But she's not out there campaigning for same-sex marriage. She's not at the Pride Parade, right? But this issue, because sexuality has become sort of the flashpoint issue as a sort of litmus test for how you read the Bible. That's what this is really about. So it's that issue that becomes the reason for this rift. Interestingly, the letter had no other signatories, so no other bishops or archbishops or anyone co-signed this letter. So it's unclear, like, were other people involved in writing it? Do they agree to this? Are they willing to fully sever ties with the Anglican Communion in the way that the Archbishop of Rwanda seems comfortable doing? But it's unclear what other provinces will. There's a lot of provinces that are in sort of the middle of the Venn diagram, that they're both full and active members in the Anglican Communion and also members of GAFCON. And this letter seems to be trying to get them to pick a side. And so it'll be really interesting to see what happens with that. But we need to be careful not to see this as a global south versus global north issue, and also not really as a conservative versus liberal issue, and especially not in the way that we understand that politically. It really has a lot to do with Anglican identity, what it means to be Anglican, how Anglicans understand the Bible. If you read this statement from Rwanda, it's like, that's not how I as an Anglican understand the Bible. It uses a lot of phrases that refer to a fundamentalist understanding of the Bible and of Christianity. It says that the Bible is this is kind of funny, it says that the Bible is the only source of authority, but then quotes a bunch of Lambeth resolutions. And it's like, well, which one are you? But this is really a real debate, and of course all this is very much ongoing, and more things will be released and will become clear. But can I get a volunteer to read this statement? This is the end of just sort of an opinion piece from Dean McGowan, who's the Dean of Berkeley Divinity School at Yale, and he's also an Australian Anglican priest. So he, in addition to being a brilliant scholar of early Christianity, he really understands global Anglicanism because he has been all over and has worked in different provinces. Thank you.
Not simply a global south versus global north, or conservative versus liberal issue. Those liberal-minded Anglicans who shrug at the latest conservative posturing also need to remember that their own positions have only become settled practice in recent decades, and to sneer at those who differ is to show a different form of forgetfulness and arrogance. To correlate such conservative with ethnic and national identity remains, as always, racism. It remains vital to retain and deepen our relationships, whether through the traditional instruments or otherwise. And in any case, to remember that communion is God's gift, that neither Canterbury nor Rwanda can change that. The Very Reverend Andrew McGowan, Dean of Berkeley Divinity School at Yale.
Thank you. So ends on an unclear note. I think, as I said, when I introduced this series, I mostly just wanted to talk about the election of Bishop Sarah as Archbishop of Canterbury, and then this week a lot of other things happened. And I think we're not quite sure where that will end. Will we really end up with two different Anglican communions, or will we find ways to continue to walk together in new expressions? I hope, along with you, that hope for unity is something that we can continue to work towards, that schism is rarely the answer to the problems that face us. So I encourage you to pray for the unity of the church, pray for Anglicans around the world, and also keep being who we are, right? We are going to continue our expression of the faith. We're going to continue in our Anglican identity, and we're going to continue to move forward as disciples of Jesus. So thank you all for your attention.